Hello and welcome to this Register webinar on NoSQL, the sequel to SQL. So thank you for joining, and let's see if it's worth committing to this new type of database technology. I apologize, they're coming thick and fast today. This is the last one before Christmas, so you have to bear with us all. It's all about scale today, so if we've been seeing NoSQL models move from more what could be called niche or out there applications and more into the enterprise. So the other question about scale is how can people move from using it as a more of an edge case, fringe technology into more mission critical applications in both new and more traditional organizations. And don't forget, it's not up to me to tell you where your fire exits are, but you should probably have a quick look round. From other admin points of view, ask questions at any time. And I will be checking for questions and putting them to our illustrious panel today. And there will be a survey at the end, so do please remember to fill that in. So moving on, and let's move to the panel, who's here to insert a bit of sense to the debate. First, we've got David Hackney, is that how I pronounce it?
It is.
It is, fantastic, straight in there. From Couchbase, Ian Merrington from Sky, and Dale Weil from Freeform Dynamics. And I wanted to ask you all a quick question to kick things off. First to you, David, did you really draw something? Actually, that's not the real question. Yes, they did. But we can come back to that one. But my more serious question was, how have you seen conversations evolve in this area of moving into non-SQL database forms over the years?
Yes, so my role as the Director of Engineering for Couchbase, I oversee both our support and development for Couchbase in Europe. And from the support point of view, we've seen quite a transformation in the past 3 years. So if you go back 3 years, we had version 1.8.1 of the software that was a pure key value store, so users could store documents to it and retrieve documents, but not too much else. It was a very high performance cache or database solution. But since then, in the last 3 years, seeing quite a transformation from a key value database to a document database with a host of other features. And what this has enabled is enterprises to deploy it in a much wider, for a much wider range of use cases within their environment. So it's gone from being a traditional, if I need high scalability, I look to a NoSQL database to, like I say, a much broader range of use cases.
We'll be looking at that. Ian, yourself, you're the customer here, so you've been doing stuff with NoSQL and with Couchbase. How have you seen Sky's use of such technologies evolve over the past 3-4 years?
So Sky have really embraced NoSQL technologies. We're such a large user base, and we need the advantages of the scaling, the stability. And we've got so many different types of products as well that I think Sky have allowed us to build our own sort of NoSQL experiments and let them sort of turn into something much bigger now. And so I'd say most of the teams that we're dealing with on a daily basis have got some form of NoSQL, either as a caching layer in front or as the whole solution. So we've really found it very great. It's mission critical now for a lot of our tools and applications.
And Dale, we're not preaching to the converted here. We don't want to talk to people that think it's already great. So for people that haven't even looked at NoSQL before, how should they even start understanding whether or not it fits into their environments?
Well, I think the obvious thing is that the requirements are changing quite rapidly, both in terms of scalability, but also in terms of different styles of applications. People use the term digital to refer to a whole bunch of different ways of communicating and engaging with customers, for example, but also internally with your workforce. And a lot of this is bringing just, let's say, non-traditional solutions to bear, and they just have different requirements from a data management, access, handling perspective. And traditional relational databases have been stressed as a result. They can only take you so far, and a lot of people are not necessarily getting into NoSQL in a very proactive way, but sometimes in a reactive way, in that they're hitting the wall with relational, and they're looking around, and then they discover the alternative way of doing things, and that is kind of what's changing. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but you know, what's driving activity is changing a little bit.
It's interesting. I mean, a few years ago we might have done one of these, and the conversation would have been around how to break down the silos. It's almost like you say, well, the silos are kind of breaking down all by themselves now, and so we need to look at other ways of managing that.
Yeah.
So other ways of managing that brings us to this NoSQL thing, which I'd love to pretend that I know all about it, but frankly I just don't. And you used some terms earlier, David, about documents and graphs and things, but that doesn't actually mean anything to me. And maybe there are a few people out there that might need just a quick insight into what some of these terms mean.
Sure, so a quick primer into NoSQL. So traditionally, databases have followed we'd have a relational model where the data is separated in a tabular fashion. So you have tables, you have rows, you have columns, you have fields, and yes, so a very structured format, because traditionally the price of storage was expensive. There was an art to normalizing this data, so you would only ever keep one copy of it. So if 4 people lived at the same address, you would keep one copy of that address, and all of the people in your database would refer to that other address. What this means is if you ever need to retrieve all of the data about that person, you have to look up the personal details from this table, you have to look up their address details from that table, which was very space efficient. But in these days, now you've got, everyone's got a mobile phone, everyone's got a device, and these things are being hammered constantly. Actually, the time it takes to look up all these individual separate pieces and join them together means that it's the response time is slowed for users. And so actually the NoSQL way breaks this whole model down and says, actually, if you just put all of the information about a single person, for this example, in the one document, you can just say, here's a document, he's arrived on my website, arrived at my application, just give me all of his details in one swoop. So it's a much simpler, sort of straightforward transaction. So that's the big difference. You've gone from this tabular structure of storing your data with a schema.
It's already all in one place.
All in one place. Still retaining a little bit of structure, so you might see it in an XML format, or in Couchbase's terms, a JSON format. So within the document itself, you do retain some structure, some fields and some values, but all of the data that you require for your business operation is in one place.
I'm going to say something dumb here. This is nothing about SQL, is it? Which was the language to query this stuff. This is about the structure behind the thing. So
yes, it's a little bit
matter
both.
what language you use.
It's how the data is stored, and also the primitives you use to access that data. So rather than doing your SQL like select star from here to retrieve your bits and pieces from the various different tables, there's a key value model, which is give me a unique ID. Again, in the user example, it might be your email address or your user ID, and say, here's a user ID, here's the document that corresponds to that user set, like store that in the database. Or users turned up, here's their ID, retrieve me all of the...
Just gives you a lot more options. Right, okay. And that's, there you go. So now you know everything there is to know about these models, which is really great, and I've certainly learned. Thank you very much. And that'll be all for No, I'm joking. We've started, a lot of people are kind of concerned. The analogy I was working on earlier when we were talking about this is some organizations are kind of still going up the hill towards actually accepting other ways of doing things. Some are at the top and kind of looking around and saying, yeah, well, actually, this is quite cool. We could do some stuff with this. And some are on the downhill slope, you're really expanding their use. And I thought, I don't know, Ian, Dale, maybe pick up on in terms of where organisations find themselves across these different phases of adoption.
I'll just tackle that one to begin with. I mean, you mentioned over the last 3 years you've seen quite a lot of changes. Interestingly, before coming on here, I looked back at some register research data. We survey the register readers quite frequently, and about 4 years ago we did a survey around database technologies, storage technologies, and so on. And NoSQL was there, but it wasn't particularly high up the list of must-do technologies, must invest in technologies. It was still pretty much fringe. In the meantime, we've seen a lot of this technology mature and reach a stage, as David was saying, of ticking all those ILITI boxes, scalability and security, and all of the other stuff that's required. So what we've kind of seen today is it's hard to have a conversation with a CIO or an architect where this kind of technology isn't part of what they're thinking in terms of going forward. And particularly this time of year, we've been doing a lot of senior level interviews with various people over the last couple of months and talking about next year's investments. And NoSQL is very much on the agenda for next year in lots of organizations. And it's building on some initial sort of niche activity, proving the concept activity. And the big question is, how do we actually scale this up and take it enterprise-wide?
I'm interested as well, this concept of niche versus mainstream, and I'm going to throw in the word agile early and get it out of the way, in terms of are more projects going into that kind of try it out experimental thing anyway? Or?
I think it's when does it become normal? Until relatively recently, in lots of organisations, if you said you wanted to build this, if it was a fringe application, no one really cared that much. But if it was something that was going to be real critical to the business, and you said, I want to do it on this, let's say, unfamiliar platform, people would raise an eyebrow, and you'd have to justify it. And I think we're getting to a stage now where some organisations are moving faster than others, but in quite a few organisations now, NoSQL is kind of accepted as being an option depending on the requirement. That's not that they're stopping using Relational, but they're open-minded now about using this stuff, and they're comfortable with it.
And coming back on that, and I know we've talked about this with Sky, Ian, a lot of it's about the fact that you're getting pressure from the outside. So again, something that we were discussing earlier was Game of Thrones. In terms of, it's not about what you do, it's about what you need to do in response to what's actually going on.
Yeah, I mean, Game of Thrones is a great example for us. It is a TV show that is very, very popular with our online viewers. And the demand in traffic just at the start of that TV show was too much for the RDBMS solutions. We've only been able to cope with it since moving on to our NoSQL platforms, and we have had some production outages, and you can't fail at that point because it's a season opening. Everyone who's online watching, they've got immediate access to Twitter, to Facebook. If you're not able to serve their requests at that time, the whole world knows about it straight away. And NoSQL has given us the ability to cope with that demand.
You just had no choice.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, really. And our adoption of it was we were able to use it as a cache in front of an RDBMS database. So as we're using it as a cache, we were able to get the benefits of it without necessarily worrying too much about the limitations at the time. And that was kind of our route into the NoSQL world.
And I think that's quite consistent with what we see from a lot of customers. So Sky have Game of Thrones, retailers have Black Friday, where the peak of traffic for that over that weekend completely dwarfs what they see throughout the rest of the year. We have a lot of online gambling companies for which the Grand National is a huge peak in their traffic, and so I think that's normally one of the trigger points that alerts people to NoSQL when they find. We had a situation with Dixon's 12 months ago where they were using a legacy relational system for the Black Friday traffic, and it couldn't cope. And so they actually, in this day and age, they actually had to queue users up on the website to say, okay, our website will be ready to serve you in.
Wow.
Yeah, it's like the equivalent of taking an online ticket and saying stand in your queue. Whereas sort of this year they identified that, they replaced the solution with using NoSQL and have a runaway success. And it's these kind of events that are perhaps the trigger points for people embracing it. And then once they're on that path, then they appreciate that there are more uses that are.
Yeah, how would you see that balance between? I mean, one of the things we talked about was just being able to do new things, being able to take in different types of data. It's not necessarily this huge peak.
I was just going to say, actually, that sort of needs must, I would call it, level of, or driver for adoption, you physically cannot solve it with traditional technologies. Potentially you possibly could if you threw enough money at it, but it's just not cost effective to even think about it. But then there's the other part of the flexibility equation, which is that developers just find this stuff really easy and convenient to work with, particularly if they've got relatively fast-moving applications. So even if there's not huge amounts of data involved, if they've got something which is fairly iterative, a lot of customer engagement applications, for instance, you put something out there, you see how it performs, you then modify it, you optimize it, sometimes you scrap it and start again. That kind of rapid goes hand in hand with DevOps, the DevOps mindset. Way of thinking has naturally pulled NoSQL solutions into the mix, just as a way of enhancing that developer flexibility.
Developers are calling more of the shots. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think. And so it's coming from both ends, right? So you've got a lot of that let's say sort of groundswell of activity amongst developers, meeting some of these real hard edge requirements, these must-do applications that we've been talking about earlier on. And the big question in a lot of people's minds at the moment is, okay, well, this stuff now is gathering momentum in two different ways. How do we start to sort of work this into our normal way of doing things at an enterprise level?
I noticed you nodding, Ian. Is that sort of thing you're seeing in Sky?
Certainly. I mean, it's been very... because I'm from an Oracle DBA background, so it's been very liberating from me to have the developers not coming to me all the time saying, "Oh, well, we need this access. It takes too long to do this."
Starts to worry you, doesn't it? With
well, yeah, it is a little bit
for a while.
But so it's good. They can just get on with it. You still need to treat the data with care. From a DBA point of view, that's kind of always thought my role is, not necessarily just keeping the systems running, but making sure you're looking after the data. And so the developers can get on and do their thing, and it's just reviewing stuff and making sure it all makes sense and that they'll be able to get access to that data at a different point. Because it's NoSQL, or certainly a document store, is very good at accessing data from one path. There are different ways of getting it from other paths. So say, for example, it's easy to look up on the username if that's what the document's keyed on. It's not so easy to look up from some of the other fields unless you've structured your data right in the first place.
Think about that
so there's a little bit of upfront thinking. It's getting better as well. Like the vendors are stepping up and giving you better access, better ways of getting at this data. So I think that's a problem that's going to disappear as well. But
you're stepping up, David.
I hope so.
No pressure.
Yeah, I think from the developer's point of view, so managing a team of developers, like one of the worst things that you can tell them is, in order to do your job, you need to go and speak to that person over there in that other department to do that thing for you. And so actually giving them the freedom or control of a bit more control over the schema and less dependence on someone else to dictate how your data needs to be is liberating for them as well. So I think that's why it's part of the reason why it's become so popular.
So there's probably a bunch of relational guys out there thinking this sounds like a nightmare. I'd be interested in your view of this, Ian, in terms of if you've got lots of developers all creating their own schemas to store sometimes the same information but in different places, different ways, don't you end up with just a huge amount of duplication and maintenance headache and lots of risk?
You could look at it that way. I mean, within Sky, we're pretty small Scrum teams, so you're working on a day-to-day basis with the developers anyway, so you know what's going on, where it's going, and certainly within our application, because it's just profile data. It's not a very complicated application from a data point of view anyway. So it wasn't really suited to a relational schema anyway, and so. I mean, they're all intelligent guys anyway. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to do development. So I think DBAs historically they've always been that sort of in the background, just stopping the developers doing what they want to do. But I guess maybe I've never taken it as that. I never thought that's my role. My role's always been give the get the data to the developers in the best way possible, the quickest, fastest way.
Sounds to me like this is one of those situations where when you get it right, it doesn't seem to be a problem, but there will possibly be organisations out there that don't have those Scrum teams or don't have those channels of communication or have more complex data needs that maybe need to think about that. I'll throw that out there. And something else. I mean, a lot of this stuff we've been talking about has been that sort of getting better services out to customers, being able to deal with transactional peaks, etc., etc. Back end of it, we wanted to bring up the elephant, maybe in the room, a little fluffy elephant called Hadoop, which is essentially the other side of the coin, which is how to do better reporting, better analytics, how to get insights out of all that data as well. And I know that the discussion we had suggested that some people tend to think about them both in the same place. So we wanted to kind of tease those two apart. Maybe David, you could pick up on that.
The first thing to point out is it's not an either-or decision. It's not, I've got big data. Do I need NoSQL or do I need Hadoop?
Mm-hmm.
It's the two are complementary technologies, I'd say. So databases like Couchbase are very good for the operational, the transactional online side of things, where users I've got 10,000 users simultaneously accessing my website that need sub-millisecond response times, whereas the analytics side like Hadoop are useful for a bit more of the batch process and the analytics of going, okay, show me the trends of what regions or what age groups of my users are logging on at given times and things like that, which is so you see this sort of cycle where a lot of the information is taken in by Couchbase. You will then have a connector that will ingest that into your Hadoop analytics engine. That will do the crunching and then actually storing and caching the results back in Couchbase so that the application can then make use of the analytics that's been performed. So very much two technologies that complement each other, and there's definitely room for both within the enterprise.
I mean, is this a Venn diagram, these two circles? Are there some things you can do a little bit of analytics with the NoSQL stuff and a little bit of the kind of real-time operational stuff with
Sure,
Hadoop?
but I'd say horses for courses. So
Right.
the very fast online operational stuff you would go with Couchbase, and for the deeper analytics and business sort of insights you would use a Hadoop solution.
Yeah, as Ian was saying, what NoSQL's good at is when you have a fairly well-defined access path. What it's not very good at is when you want to come at the data from lots of different angles and do lots of cross-referencing and lots of sort of on-the-fly. The kind of stuff that Hadoop's very, very good at. So there is probably a little bit of overlap, but actually if you try and force Hadoop into more of a sort of online query, and I've seen people try and do that, run SQL queries with an analyst team against Hadoop. It can be done, but it doesn't provide the same kind of real-time experience, so it doesn't really work in an online application environment. And similarly, I mean, you can do a certain level of analysis in NoSQL, but you're limited in how far you can push that depending on the structure of your documents.
I mean, there's lots of preconceived ideas about a lot of this stuff in terms of what people are used to, particularly in terms of relational databases and therefore their expectations. Maybe we threw together a few of these onto the slide here. I don't know if any of these you can pick up in terms of compatibility, reliability, etc. What kind of misnomers do you think really have you been seeing from Sky's perspective?
So we were really worried from the outset about data inconsistency, whether there's going to be issues, because we're taking, ours isn't quite such a simple data structure as just a document per person. So there is a document per person, but there are other smaller documents that effectively give us different access points to the main profile document. We call them index documents, for want of a better word. And we were worried that we'd be updating the main profile and not being able to keep these indexes in sync because of, it's not transactional. How are you supposed to sort of handle it? So we spent a lot of work coming up with a process that kind of analyzes our data and makes sure it is all consistent and stuff. And we spent so much time on this, and it hasn't really ever found any inconsistencies due to using NoSQL. It's found problems in our code, which is it has proved its use, but it's the actual NoSQL solution itself has been fantastic in that respect.
Yeah, consistency is more of a business discussion, isn't it? With NoSQL, as you say, you went through, you looked at your different document types and looked at different scenarios. In a relational environment, it's more of a physical thing because you take an entity, you're exploding it into possibly updates that span 4, 5, 6, even more tables sometimes, and so you need that end-to-end transaction control, the ability to roll back. So if something doesn't quite work during that transaction, you can actually recover to a consistent state. Mm-hmm. That's a physical integrity problem, and you don't tend to, provided you're not misusing NoSQL, using it for things you shouldn't be using it for, then you don't run into the same kind of problems. So, people talk about you don't have the same level of transaction control. It's kind of irrelevant because you're not splitting your entities up and spreading them all over.
I mean, there's a governance question, isn't there? That some transactions you want to retain forever. Others, like, can I start this TV program right now? You're not so worried if that one gets lost. I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, our
Maybe
kind of data in our profile is the customer impact on if you haven't saved the terms and conditions, acceptance of the terms and conditions.
That matters.
It matters, but it just means next time they go into the app, it might, if it would pop up again, ask them again. It's an annoyance, and if it happened all the time, then that would be unacceptable. But if you're talking one transaction in a million kind of thing, it's not even going to get noticed. But we haven't seen it.
The iPlayer asks me, am I over 16 every time? Look, guys, you should know that by now.
Another thing to mention about consistency and databases as well is it's a little bit of a misnomer in that any large enterprise has exceptions and ways of dealing with these things. It's like take the stock control database. If a guy in a warehouse drops a box of eggs and smashes them, how consistent is your stock database anyway? So they've always got ways of reconciling this. So I think it's something that actually, when it comes down to reality, isn't as I think Sky found out, is something that doesn't tend to cause problems.
The consistency discussion becomes a business one. It's like, how do you deal with those exception scenarios? How, if this happens, what do you do about it? And I think the point I was trying to make was, don't confuse that with the fact that you don't have a begin transaction, a commit, and a rollback mechanism, because that doesn't really that's a different discussion, I think, to the business consistency one, because you don't need it in the vast majority of cases in a NoSQL environment.
I've got a few questions coming in, by the way, and one of them sort of relevant to this point is this just a thing for companies with lots of data? Is it basically if you're using databases just to store an average amount of customer data or whatever, does this really matter to you? Maybe David, you can pick that up. So.
Yeah, so it's certainly a thing that attracts people to NoSQL in the first place, but not exclusively. So if you are a Python programmer that isn't necessarily familiar with SQL, and you don't want to have to deal with both, then the flexible schema and all that stuff we mentioned earlier about putting a bit more control back in the developer's hands is another great use for its adoption. Something that we've not mentioned yet actually is another part of the architecture that's very important is it works in a clustered fashion. So rather than having this big one large monolithic server that's got all of your data in, it's using sort of commodity servers or cloud VMs. You cluster these things together where each of the machines within your cluster has a portion of the data. And one thing that allows you to do is keep a second copy of your data on one of the other servers. So if any problem happens with any individual piece of hardware or a VM, or you need to perform maintenance or an upgrade, what you can do is a clever shuffle of the data to keep everything online. So there's
so handy for failover, basically.
Failover and high availability, really. So to answer that question, yes, having a lot of data is a good reason to look toward NoSQL, but by no means is it the only one.
Question for you, Ian. I have a client who wants to go to NoSQL for performance. So it just struck me that this could be a familiar scenario for what you've seen internally. But our Oracle DBA constantly gets asked for business queries to be delivered within a minute. How do we achieve this in a NoSQL world? From Jano there.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not necessarily something
You don't
that,
know, do you?
I think I recognise the question.
Okay.
I've got to be honest.
Just trying to get you to do as consultancy.
Yeah. It's something that we're looking at the moment within Sky. So at the moment we still have an Oracle database that sits behind our NoSQL store. We run a lot of business queries on that server. It would be nice to not have to try and keep two databases in sync.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are looking at the new Nickel solution that Couchbase are offering.
That's the query language.
The query language for Couchbase, yeah. And it's not going to be as fast as Oracle.
It's not going to be under a minute.
It's not going to be under a minute, but does the business really need the answer in less than a minute? If you're talking an hour instead,
You can't have it, Jano. Okay, you can't have it. Good segue into Sky, I think, because what we wanted to do was drill into your environment and the specific problem that you've been trying to solve and why NoSQL and, for that matter, Couchbase, given that they thought you were worth bringing along to talk about it. It's what they brought to the party. So if you could just give us an insight into the problem you were trying to solve first, that would be really helpful.
Yes, so the Sky have got a large online presence. We have millions of users who need to be able to access all the various services that they've got. So that's like My Sky, Sky Go, and now recently the Now TV proposition as well, which is a way of consuming Sky without actually having a satellite dish or anything like that. So all of these profiles are stored in our Sky Identity platform. We have many different applications, many different ways of accessing the Sky profiles, from mobile phones, from Roku devices, Apple TV, and just from your web browser and everything. So we've got a lot of people, and historically it was always Premiership football would get a massive spike in demand for European nights, for Premiership, Saturday games. Surprisingly, midweek games got more traffic. I think more husbands sort of hiding in the back room, logging onto their.
No idea what you're talking about.
Just be doing the washing up, darling.
Yeah, exactly. And so that drove us to a NoSQL solution, which we were using as a cache over the old legacy kind of Oracle schema. And this was slightly before my time, so I arrived, we already had a NoSQL cache in place. We were using Big Couch, which is a fork of CouchDB, and that I sort of turned up for the interview, and the architect and the old DBA were arguing about whether NoSQL's right and whether Oracle rules everything. And I remember sitting there thinking, well, it's profile data. It's quite a flat data structure anyway. You know, you're only ever interested in getting one person, one profile, one password, and it's a perfect use case for a document store. So it's quick. You just say, give me the profile for that user, or is this the right password for this user?
So let me just be clear on this. This use of NoSQL by Sky was driven by the need to help blokes watch football.
Yes.
That's the primary driver for the NoSQL implementation here.
Yes, of course.
Fantastic. Yeah, okay, I just wanted to be clear on that.
And so, yeah, it kind of spun up from we had an old architect, a French guy called Julien,
Mm-hmm.
who was very passionate about NoSQL, and I think he's done some work with Couchbase before. You can catch him on YouTube, I think, with a talk which explains our entire architecture and everything. So he was very keen on this. I sort of came in as an Oracle guy and thought, it's interesting, but I didn't really get involved with the NoSQL.
Still going up the hill on the...
Yeah, I was like, I'll be convinced. And then, the sort of disaster almost, our vendor said, actually, we want to take... we're just going to offer the database as a service now. We're not going to let you install it in your own data center, which was completely unacceptable for all kinds of reasons at Sky. So we had a very short period of time to come up with a new vendor. Couchbase used CouchDB, as a back end. So our developers were immediately familiar with that side of things. It used like a memcache interface at the front. Again, we were using memcache for our session store at the time. So
What's memcache?
memcache is just an in-memory key value store kind of thing.
Okay.
So
It's cache, it's in memory, it's
Yeah.
memcache. Okay.
So yeah, we're using that for sessions. So they're already familiar with all the technologies. So Couchbase was a good fit in that respect. It's also because of the in-memory aspect of it. It is very, very performant. We need to be able to respond to our clients very quickly and very consistently as well, because there's so many different integration points with us.
But this, I mean, so essentially, you know, the blokes in football, it is profile information which is relatively succinct, but you've got crap loads of these people that are needing to access the profiles
At once, yeah.
at once, and so it is just getting straight to that information very quickly, not having, you know, the computer equivalent of Madge running off into the back room and getting a bit out of here and a bit out of here and a bit out of here.
That's it. And you can't, the streaming platforms need us to be able to provide that information
Just like that.
just like that, so that we don't back up their systems. And so we're kind of the gateway to it all. As long as we're up and available, then we don't back up problems.
I mean, this is useful to me as a non-database person, because essentially there are some very specific use cases that kind of fit that mold, small amounts of information, large number of people trying to access it simultaneously, in order, not necessarily in order to do anything with that information, but in order to, that information is a gateway to actually what they're trying to do, so access a service or, you know, buy a product or something like that. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think absolutely, and I mean, part of one of the titles for this entire podcast is NoSQL fit for the enterprise, and Sky here a testament to. The answer is an unequivocal yes. Sky are already sat here as a large enterprise using it as part of their mission critical infrastructure. If the husbands can't watch the football in the back room, Twitter will hear about it, and the reputation will be.
I don't want to sort of say that it's just down to one particular gender that enjoys football more, but I think possibly if the wife also likes it, then everyone can watch it in the front room, can't they? So it's simple as that. But I mean, on that note, though, it's not necessarily going to be good for everything, is it? And you did have some challenges using it in that enterprise environment. So.
Yeah, so we came to, we're using Couchbase 2.5 at the moment. We're migrating onto the later versions as we speak. Should be there doing it now, really, rather than. But there was some. I think we had an advantage in that we'd already proven NoSQL by using Big Couch beforehand, so that some of the things that that Couchbase wasn't quite so good at the time were still at least as good as our previous vendor. So, but we did have issues around, because in an enterprise environment, and this is stuff that's been picked up by sort of audits of the projects and stuff, is the stuff's not there or wasn't there in place for like auditing of actions that have happened on the database cluster. Security there was only really one or two users that Couchbase let you use. This has all been changed in the later releases. It's got integration into LDAP so that you can actually manage your access to the database within your sort of corporate.
I mean, these are sort of enterprise features.
So the enterprise features, yeah. There's now an audit log that you can consume in Splunk and make sure that nobody's doing anything stupid on your cluster. So these things are all good, and it's moving in the right direction. So I think once we're on the latest and greatest, these questions I get from the auditors will have gone, thankfully, because we have had to spend time building our own kind of security access and controlling that in a sort of more not so effortless way. We've had to build stuff, write stuff to analyze other logs to say who's logged in, so that has been a problem. But it looks like that's now we're sort of over the hill.
Do you think these would be reasons why people go, actually, hang on, this isn't ready for me yet?
Yeah, it's been moving so quickly, and over the last year, 18 months, we've seen a lot of new features, new capabilities coming in to deal with these concerns. And interestingly, I can't actually quote the organisation, but let's just say a big global bank. I was talking to someone there just a couple of weeks ago, and they were just explaining to me how they were using this kind of technology. Now that's a highly regulated environment. So you mentioned auditing, being able to track what's going on in terms of activity on the cluster. These are all very, very fundamental in that kind of environment. Now they're using it at the moment mostly for analytics and some sort of caching for their online stuff. But you can see that it's ticking all the right boxes now, both from a compliance point of view and from a manageability point of view in terms of how you look after it and how it snuggles into your enterprise architecture.
I think that's very consistent with what we see in our customer base as well, is that rewind the clock 24 months, 36 months, you had to work quite hard to justify why you wanted to bring this technology into your environment. And I think you mentioned kind of over the curve or ticking the boxes, that those conversations are becoming an awful lot easier with the features that have been added to make it a more complete database product rather than just a NoSQL database product.
Yeah. And what's interesting is what this guy was explaining is in his environment, that they've been using it for quite a while, and they had to, and for some of the reasons we mentioned earlier in terms of scalability and certain workloads that they weren't able to deal with otherwise. And also they saw it as a competitive advantage in terms of being able to do certain things with their online properties that they couldn't do before. So it's not that they weren't doing it, but they had to do a lot of handcrafting, a lot of manual processes, and he was saying, we're able to now do this in a much more automated way than maybe we were used to. So it just got easier, I think, and that lowers the barrier for adoption for other organisations who.
Which gives us a good segue into broadening the adoption into different use cases. I wanted to pick up with you, Ian. Sorry, you're David. Temporary slip there. About the kinds of areas that people tend to start with using NoSQL databases, and then the kinds of areas they tend to move into once they've built that confidence.
Yeah. So I think we've discussed quite a bit about the user profiles, the ability to store all of your users' details, your purchase history, the purchase history, your favourites, your preferences, all in one place. So you have easy access to that. And if you flip between your phone to your tablet to your laptop, you're getting that same consistent view over and over again.
That's a design pattern almost, isn't it? It's, there's the stuff you need to know in order to do the stuff you're trying to do. Design pattern, almost.
Exactly, and you've got that kind of expands then into the 360-degree customer view. So we've probably all experienced when you phone for the support of a telecoms provider or a utility provider, you get passed between different departments and they somehow have a different view of your data. So actually another common use case that we're seeing more and more is using Couchbase as a storage for all of the customer information all in one place, so that all departments have access to this central hub of information. So, I mean, and this is, we've got, it's one of the great pleasures of my job is dealing with organisations like Sky and other sort of A-list companies, and seeing how they're using it for their particular use case. It might be for your club card points, it might be for flight booking information, it might be, it's really...
It's interesting. I think that those two different views, one which is about a very specific need that needs to be highly scalable, things like the 360-degree view. Uber doesn't care about 360-degree view because it only does one thing. It does, and it's just trying to do that one thing very well and expand rapidly. Whereas your Tesco's and so on, they've got a great deal of potential understanding.
I think one way of thinking about it is think of all the data warehousing projects that you've done over the years, and you pulled data together and
Didn't take me long. But,
and that's been great for internal analysts and internal consumption. But you would never connect up your data warehouse to the outside world. And I think what we're doing here is, saying, well, we can take some of those sort of aggregation principles, collation principles, but actually operationalize it, so you can actually now plug it into applications.
And it's still a real challenge, isn't it? It's an easy phrase to trot out.
It's not magic, no, of course.
But it's a very, very hard thing to do still for a lot of organisations.
Yeah, and it is still as much about process and modelling and as it is about technology. So you can't get away from that.
One of the really interesting sort of upcoming trends is the whole the Internet of Things, where everything's got a sensor on it that's just bleating out data as fast as it can go. You've got these oil pipelines with millions and millions of sensors on them, all churning out data like nobody's business. Until very recently, it's been very hard to actually harness that data and put it all in one place. And so this is where we see another avenue of the technology being very fruitful, is actually having the ability to store that data, and then either with its own query capabilities or with Hadoop being able to actually make sense of all of that data all of a sudden.
It's interesting. We've got a good question here on that topic, I think, which, I think it's on that topic. I'll let you decide. It says, would you agree then that this is not ready for the health or patient data environment? And you mentioned the Internet of Things, and I'm immediately thinking of the machine that goes ping, and how to link that in. So are you seeing healthcare use cases?
Yeah, I think the NHS are a big user of NoSQL. I mean, the question is, it's oversimplifying it, saying, or would you necessarily want to store all of your patients' records in a NoSQL database? You could ask the same question of any database and say, actually, does your solution, should it exist only in software? Should you have backups and all of these other things? So I don't think there's nothing there's no additional risk brought about by using NoSQL. So absolutely, I think there's.
I'm just wondering, because if I was in a hospital stuck on a bed, I think I'd want more than a 180-degree view of me as a customer in that situation. So it may be, I don't know, maybe back to the governance point, Dale, in terms of what you should store versus what you can store.
Yeah, I think there are different reasons for getting or different requirements that fall under this 360-degree view question. And one of them is are you trying to operationalize that, or are you trying to form it for analytics purposes and understanding and segmentation and so on. And I think as soon as you start to operationalize it, then NoSQL lends itself pretty well to that whole process. The other thing which we mentioned at the beginning is the flexibility side of things, because we're dealing with we're getting away from the idea of having a rigid schema. Customer data tends to kind of proliferate in new and different ways on a fairly ongoing basis. So when new data types, new objects, new things that you just want to store for a customer start to be added into the mix, you're in a much better position to actually accommodate that. So it gives you that flexibility.
And that's certainly true in healthcare, because suddenly you need to know, I don't know, the height becomes very relevant to a situation that it wasn't relevant before.
Yeah.
But you don't have a field for height, so what do you do? And
Yeah.
I think we've all seen those databases where you store a certain very important piece of information in the additional field 3 kind of setup, just because that's the only field available at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to start to wrap up, but I think we've covered a lot of the topics in terms of where you can start. There's a couple of the reason I'm pausing is because I know there's a couple of questions about, well, so is our relational databases dead? So maybe I'll just get them out of the way, and then they won't be on the tip of my tongue, because we've had 2 people saying, do you think vendor locked-in relational databases are dead, or are they complementary to the NoSQL world? Maybe you can answer that as a kind of longer-term view. It's the same as the other question: do relational databases have a future?
I'm sure they do. I mean, the skill sets are out there. It's not. There's so many people invested in using them. They're still going to be using them. But I personally, after 15 years as an Oracle guy, I don't see my next piece of work being in a relational kind of world. I want to stay in the NoSQL kind of area. So it's, they're going to have their uses, but I think it's once you've used NoSQL for any length of time, the simplicity and it's almost liberating. I think.
Is it just more natural?
It just feels very natural. You just I just want to store that there. Not I want to store that there, but then I need to break that down to there. Put it there.
Let it out.
It is. It's one of those things. That I've really enjoyed everything I've done so far in NoSQL. I think the more people use it, the more people will realise that it's an easy way of doing it. And I'm talking from a DBA kind of point of view. The effort required to build a clustered NoSQL, certainly a Couchbase one, it's so simple. It's like 5 or 6 commands and you've got a 10-node cluster. And then you're like, oh, I want a 10-node cluster over there, and sync the data between them. That's another 10 commands.
Maybe the counterpoint to that, I don't know, is there will always be a place for normalized tables connected via indices.
Yeah, I do think for the time being, just given the state of technology and how it's likely to persist over the next sort of three years or so at least, if not 5, it's thinking, are you dealing with a normalized view of the world where you're denormalizing by exception, or are you dealing with a denormalized view of the world where you can focus on single entities and normalize by exception with your, you mentioned index
Yes.
documents, for instance, that you use. So it's where do you start? Do you start with that? Is the application you're building naturally lending itself to a normalized model? And there, a lot of that is about questions of how you're going to access the data. If you're going to access the data in unpredictable ways, and you're going to have a lot of very rigorous consistency in the model itself for whatever reason, and the various reasons why you might want to do that, integrity, compliance, whatever, then relational is still going to be relevant. So I think if you put that together with the fact that you've just got inertia, the two are coexisting. I think my big message to people is don't just use relational as default anymore. Stand back and say, well, look, these things as of today, end of 2015, beginning of 2016, have certain strengths and weaknesses. What should we be applying to this particular need? And just be open-minded about it. This stuff is usable and it is ready, which is kind of what you were saying.
It's fun as well.
It's usable, it's
fun,
ready.
yeah.
It means people should maybe start sucking it and seeing and finding out what works for them and what doesn't. I mean, are there any other things, David, that people should think about if they haven't done it ever, just to kind of put their toes in the water and start out on the NoSQL path?
Yeah, sure. So I think Ian did a great job of identifying how simple it is to get started with it. And Couchbase as a company have invested a lot of time to try and bridge that gap between people from the relational world and the NoSQL world to make it less of a mystery to them. And so things like even just as simple as our documentation providing tutorials and copy and paste examples of install the software here and here's your 5-line Python script that has you storing a document in the database and retrieving it. Like literally that simple.
I mean, in some ways for web apps it just misses out the step, doesn't it? You don't have to think about what's going on at the back end, you just...
Exactly, there's no create table do this, it's a couple of lines, and so that along with a developer kit for all of the major programming languages out there, your Javas, your .NETs, your Cs, your Pythons, your even your Gos, and then most recently in the recent release there's even a SQL-like interface to retrieve and query the data as well, so a little bit of additional familiarity for those coming from a relational world.
Ian, would you said very much you've got a spirit of experiment at Sky. Would you recommend that, or is that just unique to your environment? Did you just get lucky with the kind of attitudes you got at your place? Or?
I think it was probably a perfect storm of the right people and the right problem. So trying to provide access for all these people at once, it just fit. And it's been very successful.
Yeah, can I just say, I mean, you mentioned fun.
It's like you don't normally hear database and fun at the same time.
You don't normally hear database people saying let's install this.
But
you talk to traditional Oracle DBAs, no offence to your previous job, but I was that man in the past. They're very defensive characters. It's like, we want to make sure that this thing is done properly, because if it doesn't perform well, it's going to come back on me, and they become this bottleneck to innovation and flexibility and everything. And I think it's just a case of lightening up and thinking a bit more, I don't know, just a sort of JDI.
Fantastic message.
Yeah, a lot of it is about that.
Stand by that. Go out and enjoy yourself.
Go out and enjoy yourself, look for opportunities to make a difference, and just sort of
do
it.
It's never been easier as well to just fire up a cluster of whichever
Just
brand
do
that
it.
you choose. There's Docker. There's
And then how did
all these
you
other
then
things.
transition? Because you said you're in version 2 of your platform now. Did you just go, whoopee, let's have more fun, or did you go, actually, there's some things you need to start thinking about now?
Well, it was driven by the need to be able to migrate data centers. We needed a NoSQL solution that had cross data center replication, which was available on Couchbase, and it allowed us to move into our bigger, better data centers so that we can have more and more customers and more people watching football in the back room.
It's all for you guys. It's all for you.
But I think that's an important message, actually, because if you have tried, I haven't known many people actually try going down this route and saying, "Oh, this was a big mistake. We've got to go back to our relational world." And I mean, you don't hear that very often. So if you haven't tried it, it's worth just sort of getting a feel for it. When people do run into problems, though, the big thing to ask is this because of NoSQL per se? Am I using it for the wrong purpose? Or is it because the tool I've chosen, there's lots of open source stuff out there, for instance, that it doesn't tick all the boxes that we talked about earlier on. Am I running into problems because I've got the wrong specific solution for what I'm trying to do in my environment? And I think that's sort of a bit of what you were alluding to. You had a very specific thing about distributed data center support.
I'm interested to pick up on the point about DBAs, about developers, about ops people, and so on and so forth. And there was a question here, do you see it, which we kind of answered before, but I'll mention it. Do you see it being primarily driven from the dev rather than the DBA contingent? I'd extend that further and say, in the future, how do you see the kind of the different roles evolving? And does it end up just with a bunch of developers doing what they like, or do you have quite specific structures that still need to be in place, do you think?
Personally, I think there's always going to be a place for somebody. I don't know what the label will be. It might not be a database administrator anymore. It might be a data engineer or something. But someone that still needs to control the data to a degree. And it's not going to be quite as tight as it used to be. But there are... It's still... You still need to know how to access it, how to get it, the best from it to... Okay, we say, it's NoSQL, it's just performant, you can do what you want with it. But if your documents are suddenly getting up to 2 mega document or something like that, then things are going to start slowing. Things are going to start slowing down again. So you still need to think about it. It's not just it's just a dumping ground for everything. So it needs some thought up front. It might be a different role, but there's still going to be that skill set required, I'm sure.
Yeah, whether it's DBAs or database architects, I mean, people have had different titles over the years, haven't they? There's always been a place for someone to sort of have a look and say, maybe, given what you're trying to do there, maybe we should denormalize that a little bit in a relational environment. And otherwise you're going to bottleneck here and you're going to, not... It's exactly the same sort of discussion, except that it's not as necessarily make or break in a NoSQL environment as it is in a relational world. But someone still has to have that conversation. It's like you're coming at it from the other end. When should we be maybe looking at normalizing, breaking this up a little bit?
Yeah. And where NoSQL is at the moment, you do still need to get it right at the beginning. It's not so easy to make a change wholesale to your data if your data is unstructured.
I mean, we're going into the final remarks stage now, and I think this is one of them, isn't it? It's you still need to think about stuff up front. You still need to plan ahead, and because otherwise you do end up with extremely large documents that are untenable.
And in many ways, the fact that you've got a physical schema in a relational environment forced you to do a certain amount of analysis, so you could come up with a table structure. I mean, you had no choice but to go through that step. And I think the danger is that you can shortcut some of that kind of discipline if you're not careful, and you can get something up and running, but not on necessarily a firm foundation from a design perspective. So someone has to be there to sort of keep that discipline in place. In a agile sort of Scrum type environment, it works really well. So your DBA, database architect, becomes a sort of advisor almost in that context. So they're no longer the policeman, the administrator necessarily. They do a little bit of some of that possibly, but they play more of an advisor role.
Okay, final words then on the. Thank you very much to my esteemed panellists. Don't forget the survey at the end. Very much like to have your feedback. Any more questions that we haven't had time to answer? But I'm going to leave you with this one question, 20 seconds each. And what the question is, I'm still trying to understand, why should I care about NoSQL? So what's the thing that makes me want to do it? Last question to you, David.
to have a highly scalable, mission-critical application that can operate at any performance and scale?
Because it's more fun.
Basically to keep up. You're not going to keep up if you're stuck in the relational world with the way things are evolving.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much to my panelists, to David, to Ian, to Dale. Thank you to the Register audience, for providing us with such great questions. Don't forget the feedback form, and see you next time, and happy Christmas.